Right, thank you very much, Tamar. We'll start the lecture. I think I'll speak for about 45 or 50 minutes, in the two previous sessions, and then we'll have some time for questions. In order to link ourselves to those two previous sessions in the last 2 weeks, I want to remind us that we read two very important poems that symbolize turning points in modern Jewish history and the history of Zionism. We started with Yehuda Leib Gordon, Yalag, and with his very famous poem, Hakitza Ami, Wake My People. This poem was written in 1863 and was a call for an enlightened acculturation and a social assimilation in Russian society, which was going through major developments and reforms at that time. In the second session, we read Chaim Nachman Bialik's In the City of Slaughter, Be'ir HaRiga, which in many ways was the end to that noble dream of Yehuda Leib Gordon, Yalag. The poem was written after the great pogrom in Kishinev in 1903, in the spring of that year, and was the first pogrom of the 20th century and covered very widely in Universal Press at the time. And mainly, I'd say that the message of this poem was that it made clear that defenseless Jewish life in exile is a disgrace, and that the time has now come for a real revolution in Jewish existence. If you want, you can put in context of our session this evening a call for a creation of a new kind of Jewish existence, or a new kind of Jewish individual, man or woman. In the words of my teacher, Ruth Weiss, a Jew that has power, not spiritual power, but real political and even military power. We understood last week that this poem of Bialik, Be'ir HaRiga, is considered probably the most influential poetic work written in any Jewish language since the Middle Ages. And towards the end of that session, we described its influence on the young Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky from Odessa, who at the time was drawn to Zionism and even met Herzl a few weeks before. And he translated this poem to Russian. Uh, and his potential readers in Russian were actually this entire generation of young Jews who, in a way, followed Gordon's, Yalag's call many years before to assimilate into Russian society. Now they didn't know Hebrew anymore. They couldn't understand the Hebrew poetry. But since the times have changed and we are now after the great pogroms of the 1880s and the pogrom Kishinev, all these or many of these youngsters were now drawn to Zionism, or at least to new concepts regarding Jewish existence and Jewish defense. So we can see over here a connection between Jabotinsky's translation of the Hebrew poem into Russian with the first session that discussed the possibilities of assimilating into Russian society and culture. Towards the end of last week's session, we mentioned the fact that the poem had real practical power because it was an inspiration for Jabotinsky when he he came up with this idea together with Yosef Trumpeldor to organize the Jewish Legion that in 1918, towards the end of the First World War, took part in the British liberation of Eretz Israel. And this was indeed a real revolutionary turning point in Jewish history. We didn't see, Jews didn't see a fighting Jewish regiment for much longer than 1,000 years. So we can see over here how Bialik's ideas moving the heart and mind of a young Zionist leader and creating real influence in real life. So those were our two previous sessions. Today, I want to examine even more dimensions, or I might even say deeper dimensions of this basic idea that was born with the Zionist movement regarding the creation of a new Jewish life, new Jewish mentality, new Jewish behavior, if you'd like. And the two poets and poems we will deal with this evening are the anthem of the Beitar movement written by Jabotinsky. And so we have a connection between our session this evening and last week. And then I want to bring into the picture another very important character and writer, Shaul Tchernichovsky, very close to Jabotinsky in a few ways, and in some other ways, a little different. And we'll try to say something about all this. But before we move forward to the poems themselves, I do feel an obligation to give at least a very short introduction regarding the developments the Zionist movement went in the decades, I'd say the 20 years between the end of First World War and the beginning of the Second World War, between 1918 and 1939. So of course, they were years of extreme revolutions in Jewish existence. A very, very difficult time for the Jewish people, as I will explain next week. But if we do focus on what Zionism achieved in those 20 years, so we can mention, of course, that soon after the Turkish defeat and the Balfour Declaration in 1917, First World War was over. The British mandate in Eretz Israel began in 1920, and this was an opportunity for a very serious development of Zionism. I'll mention a few, the most important dimensions of this development. First of all, until 1939, we have three big waves of aliyot. That's how we call them in mainstream Zionist history. The third aliyah in the early 1920s, very related to the figure of Yosef Trumpeldor, Jabotinsky's a close friend, was a aliyah of chalutzim, of pioneers, many of them part of youth movements. In a way, they even gave Zionism some kind of aroma or like a feeling that Zionism itself was some kind of youth movement. These chalutzim were full of ideology, mainly ideology from the left-wing side of politics, a lot of association with socialism and sometimes even communism, and they were mainly invested in the creation of kibbutzim and moshavim outside the cities of the built Palestine. The fourth aliyah is quite different from the third. Mainly, we're speaking about Polish Jews who in the first place were not part of any youth movement. They were not chalutzim, and if it was up to them, they might have stayed to live in Poland, but the late 1920s brought with them quite a serious attack on Jewish life, anti-Semitism coming from Polish government, and economical problems that developed because of this anti-Semitism. And so thousands of Polish Jews who couldn't immigrate to America anymore after 1924 started to come to Eretz Israel. I'd say these were mainly part of the urban middle class, maybe even bourgeois aspect of Zionist society, unlike those chalutzim of the third aliyah. And one has to say something that usually is forgotten, that during those years, and I'm referring to the late 1920s, there was quite a serious aliyah from Muslim countries too, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, many thousands of Jews, not remembered usually in I'd say in high school textbooks, but they definitely were part the Zionist movement at the time. And finally, the third wave of aliyah is what we call the aliyah chamishit, the fifth aliyah. Mainly we're talking about Jews German Jews who fled Nazi Germany during the 1930s, and also quite a serious number of them, a few 100,000. These aliyot created a very serious change in the world of what we call in Hebrew hityashvut, meaning the building, as I said, of kibbutzim and moshavim, but also the establishment of very strong and big cities in Eretz Israel, like Haifa, like the growing Tel Aviv, new neighborhoods in Jerusalem, etc. So that's one very important dimension of these years between the two world wars. The second dimension is the fact that Zionism gained serious power under the British mandate and created a very strong political and economic institutions that made clear that this whole project, what we call in Hebrew the yeshuv, right, the existence of some kind of Jewish autonomy in Eretz Israel is nothing less than what was called then in Hebrew a medina baderech. We are on a process to become a Jewish nation state, and many historians explain the amazing victory of Zionism in the War of Independence to the fact that the Jewish Yeshuv was organized in such a serious way in political terms and economical terms. So that's a second aspect of this development. And I'd say the third very important dimension of the development of Zionism is the very tragic fact that those years of organization of Zionism also saw the great resistance of the Arabs in Palestine, in Eretz Israel, to Zionism. If you'd like, you can call it the development of modern Palestinian nationalism. And Zionist history was now accompanied, and still is today, by this Arab resistance, which led to violence. And obviously the response of the Zionist movement to this was the development of the defensive forces, the Haganah organization, then the Etzel, known in English as the Irgun. And for sure, these organizations who, for instance, Herzl, which we mentioned last week, didn't have in mind, he couldn't see in his liberal modern European eyes such a serious clash between Jews and Arabs over the Zionist cause. So he couldn't describe or figure out this use of force to establish Zionism. But for sure, Bialik's intuition and idea in that very important poem, in the City of Slaughter, was still an inspiration, for a spiritual inspiration for the organization of Jewish defense, now not in East Europe, but in Eretz Israel, confronting Arab resistance. And the last dimension I want to mention over here is the great cultural and educational revolution that took place during those years, those 20 years. We can definitely identify a building of a very strong educational system from kindergartens through schools and high schools, and finally the establishment of the Hebrew University in 1925. Maybe important for this small course is the fact that after a long struggle, maybe even one can describe this as a battle, it was decided that the language that will be used in all these institutions would be Hebrew. And this wasn't an obvious thing. In academia, many thought that German would be the right language to use. Yiddish was still very strong amongst many Jews. Some of them quite who lived for many years in Palestine. Some just came from Poland, but Hebrew, after a long struggle, came up with the upper hand. And of course, really in the context of what we're doing over here, reading poetry, this is also a very, very powerful era of a development of a dynamic world of literature, poetry, and journalism, Hebrew newspapers, daily newspapers even, and really the fact that many of the leading poets of the time, Bialik, which we mentioned, Jabotinsky and Tchernichovsky, who we are about to talk about, Uri Tzvi Greenberg, Natan Alterman, which we will discuss next week. These figures became extremely important in the landscape of Zionist existence, both cultural and political. So what I'm trying to say is that these poets had something to say about Jewish faith and existence, and they had quite a big audience to listen to them. I'm not sure this is the situation today. It's very difficult for me to think now of a contemporary poet or writer who has such a strong influence about the way we think about things and the way we act. So that's something to take into mind when we discussing this world of poetry. It was serious. It had a very important effect about grand strategy, politics, etc. So in any case, in the face of this reality of such a strong and dynamic development, it's no wonder that political leaders, writers, and poets believed that they are facing a very serious revolution in Jewish life. They were looking at a new world that was being created, and they definitely had room to present ideas about this image of this new society, new individual that was coming to life. So let's try and see what at least two of these important poets had to say about this revolutionary moment in Jewish existence. We'll start with Jabotinsky and the anthem of the youth movement he really built, Beitar, and then we'll try and say something about Tchernichovsky. So it will be impossible for me to describe in such a short while the biography of Jabotinsky. Of course, he was a great leader, one of the greatest leaders of the Zionist movement. We already met him last week. We saw that he found himself in Egypt during the First World War. He organized that Jewish Legion in the British Army. After the war, he settled in Jerusalem, became an important figure in Jewish politics over there. He was member of Asefat HaNivcharim, which is the Assembly of Representatives, one might say a parliament of the Jewish community or Jewish autonomy existing under the British mandate. But in 1923, he took a different path. And this was actually a very important year in the life of Jabotinsky for three main reasons, okay? First reason was that in 1923, Jabotinsky created the revisionist party in the Zionist movement. After being for 3 years in the mainstream leadership of Zionism, he got into a very serious argument with Chaim Weizmann, the leader of Zionism at the time, regarding the final target of the Zionist movement. Jabotinsky had envisioned a state that was built on the two shores of the Jordan River, right? His great idea of, in Hebrew, Shtei Gadot LaYarden, the Jewish state has the west and eastern sides of the Jordan River. And from that point onwards, he was the leader of this very strong opposition movement inside the Zionist movement. And I can't get deep into this, but this revision he was talking about had a very strong context with political and economical debates. Jabotinsky was a real liberal, standing, I'd say, on the right wing of world of economics, etc., while the mainstream of Zionism was identified much strongly with socialism. So it's left and right over here. Besides his vision about the Jewish state and how it should, when and how it should be established. The second aspect, or the second development of Jabotinsky's career in 1923 was the establishment of the Beitar youth movement. We'll, in a few minutes, read the words of the anthem he wrote for this youth movement. But basically, Beitar, which was established in East Europe, not in Eretz Israel in its first stages, had in mind, or it was really Jabotinsky's mind, to create, to educate a new generation of young Jews, young boys, young girls, to really adopt his ideas about politics, economics, and Jewish culture. Very national, very focused on national issues and the strong idea of force. Maybe even to, one can put it, Jabotinsky was looking to trying to create a Jewish army out of this youth movement, which really, with its uniforms and songs, it really looked in many ways like a some kind of army brigade. So we'll soon go back to Beitar and what it stood for. But I do want to mention one more important thing that happened with Jabotinsky in 1923. And I want to share a document over here with you. It's not over here, so never mind. Tamar, I created a handout with a few texts that speak about Jabotinsky's very important article, Kira Barzel, the Iron Wall. I think we won't have enough time to go into it now, but maybe we can say that whoever wants those texts, we'll be happy to.
We can send them out in an email to whoever participated. So send it to us, and we'll pass it on to everyone.
Okay, so again, I apologize. I don't have enough time to go into this very extremely important text, but I did bring together a few quotations of historians who explain that basically Israel's grand strategy regarding its relationship with the Arab world and the importance of the ultimate power of Tzar, of the IDF, was explained by David Ben-Gurion in the 1950s, a few years after the War of Independence. But it is very clear that almost all his ideas, Ben-Gurion's ideas about Israel's grand strategy, came directly from this essay Jabotinsky wrote, originally in Russian. It was translated to Hebrew and Yiddish. And there's a very, if you haven't read this text, you have to read it. It's very easy to find on the web. It really is a brilliant explanation about Jewish power in Eretz Israel, in Palestine, and what Jews need in order to survive in such a difficult environment. And really, one can see, I think it wouldn't be an exaggeration to see a connection between those ideas of Chaim Nachman Bialik in his poem after the Kishinev pogrom to this essay, The Iron Wall by Jabotinsky 20 years later, and from there to Ben-Gurion's ideas 30 years later in 1953, all focusing on the ways the Jewish state Israel should be defended. So you really can see our historical thread over here moving forward, but still very strong. So 1923 is an important year in Jabotinsky's life for all these reasons. And now I want to look into the anthem he wrote for the Beitar youth movement he established in that year. So let's look at the words. I'll read them. I think we have it over here phonetically, but I'll read it in Hebrew, and you can follow me with the English translation. And as usual, I'll say a few things about the poem, and then we can say more about it with your questions. The truth is, the melody of this poem is very powerful. I'm too embarrassed to sing it out loud now, and we don't have the ability to hear it, but I really urge you to, after the session is over, to just put it on YouTube. It's extremely powerful. So in Hebrew, it goes like this. Beitar, migov rikavon ve'afar, בדם וביזע יוקם לנו גזע, גאון ונדיב ואכזר. ביתר הנלכדה יודפת מסדה, תרומנה בעוז והדר. הדר, עברי גם בעוני בן שר, עם עבד, עם מלך, עם הלך, נוצרת בן מלך, בכתר דוד נעתר, באור ובסתר, זכור את הכתר, עטרת גאון ותגר. תגר, על כל מעצור ומצר, עם טל או תרד, ולהט המרד, סנס להצית אין דבר, כי שקט הוא רפש, הפקר דם ונפש, למען ההוד הנסתר, למות או לכבוש את ההר, יודפת מסדה ביתר. So let me make a few remarks about the song. First of all, the organization Beitar. Beitar stands for the words Brit, Yosef Trumpeldor. We usually write Trumpeldor with the letter Tet. Over here, Beitar, it's in a taf. One can play with those two letters. We see over here the very strong friendship that developed between Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor during the First World War. Trumpeldor was, of course, killed in Tel Chai in 1920 in an event that became really part of the Zionist mythology. And the interesting part of this thing is that Trumpeldor was identified very strongly with the left-wing Chalutzi pioneer part of Zionism. He himself was a part of he was part of socialism, and socialist youth movements admired him. And the fact that Jabotinsky used his name for his right-wing youth movement says a lot. So that's one thing to remember, or to know and remember. And now I'll move one step forward to think about Jabotinsky's historical perspective over here. Why did Jabotinsky use Trumpeldor's name in a word that has inside it a taf? He could have written, the name could have been Beitar Brit Yosef Trumpeldor with a tet. So of course, what he had in mind was not this homage to Yosef Trumpeldor, but the city of Beitar, which is quite famous in the world of Jewish Agadah. from 2,000 years ago. Beitar was probably the last place where a Jewish army fought in Eretz Israel during the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century. So what you can see over here, something very powerful. Jabotinsky is referring to that historical event, the last defeat of a Jewish army in Eretz Israel, while he himself is the real organizer of the new first Jewish army who came back to Eretz Israel. So he's really trying to build over here a bridge built on 2,000 years of exile. So what was lost over there can now be regained. You can see over here in the first stanza, he doesn't mention only Beitar, but 2 other places, Yodefet in the Galilee, in the Galil, and Masada, of course, near the Dead Sea. 2 more places that in the writings of Josephus, Yosef ben Matityahu, are places where a Jewish army was defeated by the Romans 60 years before the Bar Kokhba revolt in the great rebellion against the Romans, but still, all 3 places combined together, places of defeat, and can now be a new source for as he puts it, strength and glory. Okay, so you can see over here a very strong feeling of the movement or the revolution in Jewish history. Over here, in the 2nd stanza, we can see the word Hadar, which of course, I assume at least some of you, whoever's listening to me, grew up in the world of Beitar, so you know what Hadar means. This is I don't know if it's an abstract, but it's some kind of approach towards how a Jew or Jewess should appear in the world, how to dress up, how to stand up, how to speak, how to behave. And Jabotinsky was really looking, if we are talking about a revolutionary concept over here, Jabotinsky was looking for a creation of a new kind of Jewish body language or appearance in the world, all folded in this word Hadar. For many years, if you had met a girl called Hadar in Eretz Israel, you could you could know almost for sure she was part of Beitar or the Jabotinsky fans. And in any case, towards the end of the stanza over here, we can see this very important idea, which Jabotinsky definitely took from Jewish thought through all the generations. This very romantic idea that if you really want to know what Jews are, they are sons of kings, princesses, if you'd like, in disguise. They look like tramps on the road. That's how they look from the outside, but they really are Bnei Melachim, sons of kings. And Jabotinsky over here he wants to restore this, okay? He's looking for the crown of Hamelech David, of King David, which we now have to regain. So of course, you know that Jews say, they have this amazing saying, David, Melech Israel Chai V'Kayam, King David loves, he always loves, or in different poems and brachot, we remember the kingdom of David. It existed sometime in the past, it was lost. Now it's time to regain it. So, and it's very interesting to see that although Jabotinsky was, of course, a very secular person in his personal life and definitely a secular leader of the Zionist movement, he is dealing over here with a very religious and ancient concept about the lost kingdom of David and the fact that now is the right time when this is now a potential time to bring it back to life. And so we have Beitar, we have Hadar, and we have Tagar. Tagar is really, I'd say, calling a challenge. And what Jabotinsky says over here basically is, this is our last chance. we have to fight this battle till its end. We have to be victorious. There's no going back. There won't be another option. So we have to challenge everything that confronts us and overcome it. And with these final, very powerful words, lamut or lichbosh et ahar, okay? We are now going to do this. We're going to conquer the hill or die. And those are the only two options we have. And one a question I was asked last week was about the great poem named Masada by Yitzhak Lamdan. So obviously Masada is now gaining a lot of power in Zionist thought from Jabotinsky's ideas over here, 1923. Lamdan's Masada was written in 1927, but we do have over here a very strong understanding that there is some kind of resemblance, maybe tragic, maybe one won't, not everybody likes this idea, but there is a connection between the standing in Masada as like the final fortress. We have now this last chance. If we were defeated last time 2,000 years ago, now we'll try it again, and this time we'll have to succeed. And I think it's fair to say that also with a tragic aspect to it, with the idea, I don't know if it's a romantic idea, heroic or tragic, or maybe all three, that we might be defeated in the end, but this time, if we will be defeated, we're going to be defeated with our weapons in our hands. Okay, so these three words, Beitar, Hadar, and Tagar, I think wrap up very clearly Jabotinsky's understanding of this revolutionary Jewish existence, a strong connection to the past, a establishment of a new kind of Jew, and the fact that this is the final front, the final battle, and we just have to be victorious in it. Okay, so I'm sorry I can't sing this out loud to you, but again, with the melody, it becomes much more powerful. We have about 15 minutes to speak about Shaul Tchernichovsky, which is not a long time, but I will try to say a few things about him and where he resembles Jabotinsky and what they had a few arguments about. So Shaul Tchernichovsky was born in 1875. And of course, as he grew up and became a famous Hebrew poet, he was really the complete opposite of Chaim Nachman Bialik, which we discussed last week. Chaim Nachman Bialik obviously didn't write only The City of Slaughter, Be'ir Hariga. He wrote many important classical Hebrew poems. And his biography, which is reflected in his poetry, really brings to life in front of us this very specific character of a young Talmid Chacham, a young scholar who grew up in a very religious environment and invested many of the years of his youth in studying Torah, and so he never enjoyed life. He didn't see sunlight, he didn't play outside. He was always inside in the Beit Midrash learning. And then when he met modernity, he was in some kind of a crisis of identity, yearning for the years he did study and was close to God, but now he becomes a modern individual and maybe even a modern artist or poet, and he has to move for his entire life between these two kinds of existences. So Shaul Tchernichovsky was the complete opposite. He grew up in a small village in Ukraine. His parents were part of one of those attempts of the Russian government I mentioned in our first session to do something in order to modernize the Jews. And one of these brilliant ideas was to send at least a few thousands of them to become peasants in southern parts of Russia, in Ukraine. So these Jews were usually quite remote from, obviously, from great cities, from centers of religious life. And so Shaul Tchernichovsky, he knew something about Yiddishkeit. He learned Hebrew, and he was a master of Hebrew, of course, but basically his entire life, and completely unlike Chaim Nachman Bialik, he was a secular Jew. And actually his physical appearance made us very clear, because he was always, he struck people who met him as a very strong person, with a lot of hair, big, happy mustache, and a lot of physical power. And he was usually known as the Greek, right? Not the frail and pale Jew, but someone who is really an outsider to the existence of a religious Jewish life. And for him, this made it much easier for him to think about this new kind of Jew that should develop now with Zionism. So and first of all, this brings Tchernichovsky close to Jabotinsky. This is something I mentioned last week. Jabotinsky, in many ways, had the same biography. He came from the city of Odessa. Odessa, in the southern part of Russia, was well known for being a very secular place, where religious life couldn't really develop in a strong way. So Jews, most of the Jews over there led a secular life. So over there, Jabotinsky and Tchernichovsky are close. And in fact, from 1890 until 1899, Tchernichovsky lived in Odessa and experienced in a very powerful way this kind of a secular Jewish existence. Later on, he went to Germany, he studied over there, he became a physician. He served as a doctor in the Russian army in the First World War, then traveled in different places in Europe, spent some time in the United States during the 1920s, and eventually in 1931 settled in Eretz Israel, and he lived there until he died in the 1950s. So what one can say about, really in a nutshell, about Tchernichovsky's poetry, that first of all, his personality, the way he was understood by his admirers, he really represented this kind of new Jew, and a lot of his most famous poems were dealing with this idea of transition between a East European exotic Jew to a new kind of Hebrew who lives under the sun of Eretz Israel and is released from all the burdens and complications that were part of life in exile. Tchernichovsky, in a very interesting way, was admired by almost all parts of Jewish society in the 1920s and 30s. He was identified with the right-wing side of Zionist movement because he was very invested in promoting Jewish defense and responding in a very harsh way to Arab violence. But he was also very respected by the left-wing parts of Zionist politics because he was speaking a lot about nature, and this was leaving the great cities and living in the agricultural environment was very close to the mentality of the world of the kibbutzim and moshavim. So he really was some kind of consensus between left and right. But if really we want to have a taste of Tchernichovsky's poetry, maybe I'll try and read two poems. Once again, we have over here two texts that become much more powerful with the melody. Again, I can't sing them, but I really urge you to, first of all, look up this first song, which is called Nietzsche Tzlalim. Okay, the shadows have clashed. A few months ago, a very lovely Hebrew singer passed away, Ilana Rubina. And she has, you can find on YouTube, she sings this lullaby, and it's just it's a beautiful thing to listen to, okay? So Ilana, Rubina, Nietzsche, Tlalim, you want to spend 3.5 minutes listening to that. This poem was written in 1896. Tchernichovsky was still very young, 21, living already in Odessa, part of a elite group belonging to the world of Chibat Zion, which we described last week, very invested in Hebrew culture. And in fact, he was visiting a friend of his, a woman called Esther Yevin, and she was singing a lullaby to her baby, and it was in Yiddish. And Tchernichovsky, now a Zionist, told her, you can't use Yiddish. We're trying to create a Hebrew cultural revolution. So she said, okay, so you come up with a proper Hebrew lullaby. So he sat down and wrote this beautiful poem. And actually that baby was a person who grew up to be Shmuel Yevin, a very famous archaeologist in the 1940s, 1950s in Eretz Israel. So this was a song written for a specific baby. He became quite famous in his field. So let me read a few stanzas from this poem. We can spend a while with it, but now we have only a few minutes. So I'm going to read this poem in a pronunciation which is Ashkenazit. Okay, and this is something that Jabotinsky and Tchernichovsky didn't agree upon. Jabotinsky was one of those writers and thinkers who thought that the new Hebrew in Eretz Israel should be the Sfaradi Hebrew, and Tchernichovsky was a great fighter for the Ashkenazi Hebrew. Okay, so we won't go deep into it, but maybe if you listen to the Hebrew I'll read over here, you'll identify the differences. By the way, Hatikva is probably the last song today that Israelis sing in the Ashkenazi pronunciation. Okay, it's not Hatikva, it's Hatikva, etc., etc. So, Nietzsche Tzlalim, Dom Tziporim, Numa Bni Efrochi, Al Mitzilelei Ofel Tagur, Itcha Ki Anochi. Yeor Mizrach, Kanfei Renanim, Tzafzefu Viranenu, Yechvar Shachar Umikedem, Yal Gam Shimshenu. So the description over here is it has like two levels in it. The mother's telling the son not to worry, although night is falling, he shouldn't be afraid. She is with him, and once the night is over, a new day will come from the east, and the birds will sing, and the sun will rise. So that's like the very simple layer of the song, but obviously the sunrise over here he's talking about is the rise of Zionism. And then soon enough he comes to this idea which became very, very famous. These words became extremely famous quite shortly after this poem was written. It's documented that many mothers already from the first aliyah and then for at least one generation forward would sing the song to their babies with these very powerful words. I'll read them out. Ivri hincha bni, ach zehu oshrecha gam asoncha. Choter geza am akdumim al ha'amim geoncha. Od chanar tigdal teda, gdolot am chapal, az tavina netzurot yifal et shimshenu yal. So we have over here again, very similar to Jabotinsky, I think, a very deep connection between this modern secular Hebrew poet and very old Jewish concepts. This idea that Jewish existence is a joy and disaster combined all the time. I think that goes very deep into Jewish mentality and the way Jews think about themselves from very early times. I'd say even in Psalms, in Tehillim, in the chapters that discuss the national fate of the Jewish people, you can find this very difficult idea that one just has to hold on to, which means, really, to put it in a very simple way, but one can think about it his entire life, that Jewish existence has this complexity in it. On the one hand, we believe, we know this from Tanakh, from the Bible, that there is a God and he's the most powerful, or the only powerful entity in the universe, and he chose us, and that means he is on our side. That's on the one hand. But nonetheless, on the other hand, for most of the time, we can't feel that fact. If we look at our national political situation, it doesn't look like he's on our side. So how does it work? And between these two understandings, one has to come up with explanations. And I'm saying this has to do that. This one can see this in Tehillim, is because over there already in the poet in Tehillim says, Ura, lama tishan Hashem, God, wake up, why are you sleeping? When he's relating to the Jewish faith. Okay, so we can see over here this sense of joy, because obviously joy, because we are connected to God, and no one is connected to him like us, but the sense of disaster working with it, because our situation so many times is so tragical. And Tchernichovsky writes over here, for this young baby, you will grow up, and then you will know the great things your nation did, and then you will understand, and you'll finally understand these great acts, et shimsheinu yal, when our sun goes up. So you can see over here, first of all, the metaphor, first of all, this very strong feeling and sense of history working from ancient times until today. And one more metaphor which you might want to add to the ideas of Jabotinsky, of Hadar and Tagar, this idea of sun, which Tchernichovsky was so identified with it. A new sun will rise, and we will live under these new skies and live a complete new existence. So we're really running out of time. So I'll just say a few words about this last poem, Ani Ma'amin, by Tchernichovsky. I believe much more well known until today in Hebrew culture as Sachki Sachki. Really a poem that was accepted very well, again, by both right-wing and left-wing sides of political and cultural life in the Zionist movement. Really an anthem about the future, the grand future of the Jews in Eretz Israel. Maybe we'll focus on this stanza, which is very famous. So he believes in mankind and in the future. You can go through the poem after the session is over, but then he comes up, he comes with these very powerful sentences. Yashuv yifrach az gam ami, uba'aretz yakum dor, barzel kvalav yusar meno, ein be'ain yire or. Okay, so he's really feeling this renaissance of the Jewish people, creating a generation in Eretz Israel with his the chains removed from him. And again, this metaphor of light, this new light on Eretz Israel. If you'd like, once again, an idea from the prophecy about Or Chadash al Zion. So again, the secular Zionist is using very ancient ideas. And Yichye ye aviv al yas, dor ba'aretz omnam chai, lo be'atid b'shamayim, chayei ruach lo endai. He will love, act, do, a generation in the land, indeed loves, not in the future in heaven. The life of spirit is not enough for it. So You can see over here beyond the physical existence, also the expectation of a renaissance in spirit, and everything that one can think that comes under the idea of a new spirit, going beyond the new body. Okay, so those were 3 poems describing different ideas about the new existence in Zionism, the Anthem of Beitar by Jabotinsky and his ideas, a little taste of some of Tchernichovsky's ideas in his great poems. I hope this gives some kind of a taste about the direction the poets were trying to lead the people to. And next week we'll move one step forward, very difficult topic, a Hebrew poet living in Eretz Israel, looking at the Shoah and trying to come to terms with it and describe Jewish existence or the Jewish faith, confronting the destruction of Jewish life in Europe. Okay, Tamar, I think I'll stop here and take some questions.
Thank you very much, Asael. First of all, I'd like to say I think it's fascinating meeting these poems, which some of them are known to many people, and understanding the background and looking at the ideas even deeply. Esther Lapkin would like to know, do you think that political Zionism, the movement to establish a real state, would have happened had there not been severe anti-Semitism and pogroms?
Okay, so that's a very difficult question to answer, because history happens only once, so we know what happened. No doubt that both Zionism in East Europe and then Herzl, and then eventually when Jews left even the Arab states, had to escape anti-Semitism in its worst ways. So there was definitely a catastrophic aspect to Zionism from the beginning. The strong sense Herzl and many other thinkers and poets had that something terrible is waiting for the Jews quite soon, and they just have to leave. But I do have to remind us that we definitely have a Zionism that doesn't depend on anti-Semitism, and it actually developed before the Zionist history we describe in this short course. For instance, we have the beautiful novel by George Eliot, Daniel Deronda, a very powerful novel, quite long, but definitely worth reading, that describes a young Jew who understands he's a Jew quite late in life, and out of the world of British aristocracy in the Victorian era, he decides to devote his life to returning Jews to Eretz Israel. And in that entire novel, there's hardly or not at all any kind of anti-Semitism. He wants to do this only because it's a noble cause, because it's something that's written in scripture, in the Tanakh. It's something that has to be done. And that's only one example. We can definitely find both amongst Jews and outside Jewish life, strong ideas that Zionism, or the return of Jews to Zionism, to Eretz Israel, is something it's something beautiful, something glorious, it's something noble. It should happen. One should dedicate his life to promote that. So we definitely have that kind of thought too, but I think it is true, historically true, to say that the terrible threat on Jewish existence in Europe in the first half of the 20th century until the Shoah definitely moved Zionism forward.
Okay, Robert Silberman asked this question after you spoke about Jabotinsky. It might be relevant also to Tchernichovsky. When they use the word Ivri, not Yehudi, is there a significance to this choice of words?
Yes, yes, I think so. Obviously, the word Ivri appears in the Tanakh before Yehudi. Avraham was already Avraham Ivri, and the Ivrim were Ivrim was the first name of the Jewish people. Mordechai is a Ish Yehudi, already after the destruction of the first temple. So I'd say that the word Yehudi, we definitely, many of us cherish it and we feel very proud about it, about being a Yehudi, a Jew. There's nothing shameful about that, of course. But I'd say that in the eyes of these poets, and not only them, we have this, again, this revolutionary idea that we are now going through a transformation, we're moving forward, but in a very interesting way. In order to move forward, we're leaning backwards. We want to go before our Jewish existence, return to our Hebrew existence, and in the East European context, leave Yiddish behind, start using Hebrew. So definitely there is a strong cultural idea of transition over here, using Ivri and not Yehudi.
Right. Max Keisler would like to know if you could speak about the influence of Nietzsche on Jabotinsky.
Okay, so not at length, but for sure, Nietzsche, who died in 1899, and his ideas really shaped the entire generation in the first two decades of the 20th century, had a deep influence on Jabotinsky, on Tchernichovsky, on another writer we don't have time to discuss over here, Berdichevsky, who was actually described as the Hebrew Nietzsche while he was alive by critics and scholars who surrounded him. Another figure, Hillel Zeitlin, was strongly attracted to Nietzsche and his thought, and even translated the writings of Nietzsche to Hebrew. David Frischman, a very important Hebrew scholar, translated Thus Said Zarathustra, כה אמר Zarathustra to Hebrew. So without going into length into this issue, no doubt that Nietzsche and his thoughts, like his very powerful basic thoughts, inspired many of these modern Zionist intuitions.